Yes, that was the Australian Technology Competitions was one of the strange little tangents I've made. So what I'm going to talk about today is coaching and mentoring, and I will just bring up the slides. What I wanted to talk about really is, can you see that okay?
Yeah.
There we go. So owning your choices, but this is about mentoring and coaching. So where I'm coming from on that is, and I'm basically just going to tell you the story of my career so far, which is far from linear, and involves some really interesting choices. And mentoring was a critical part of some of those choices, and not of some others. And what I think the mentoring and coaching gives you is takes away your blinkers and kind of changes your frame of reference. You don't know what you don't know, and by getting the view of others, that actually helps you think harder about both your own choices of career, but actually just within a business and business decisions. So what are your motivations? What are your fears? And then what are your options? Because actually, you know, there's a whole lot of options you don't know about. The other thing I think about owning your choices is, you know, whether you have mentoring and coaching to get you there or not, is owning your failures as well. I think failures are the best thing that you can ever do. You will do, you have done. And you learn so much from them. I was asked to speak at a failure breakfast a few years ago. And it was going to be people just talking. It was kind of an innovation thing, but it was people were talking about their failures. And I said, well, how long do you want me to speak for? And they said, oh, I don't know, 10 or 15 minutes. I said, well, that's not a chance I'll be able to get them all in. I'll just pick out the top 10. So I've failed many times in all sorts of different ways. And they are always fantastic experiences, maybe not at the time, but in hindsight, absolutely. So I'm just going to do a quick run through of all the sort of slightly strange things I've done. So my first choice was on leaving school. My father was particularly worried that I wanted to take a year off. And I went and lived in this building. I can actually see the window I lived in for a year on that picture. In Nova Scotia in Canada, I learned to play ice hockey. I learned to ski. I drank a lot of beer and had a fantastic time there. But what I learned from that was that I really enjoyed teaching. I really enjoyed kind of the experience of getting people where the penny drops of people kind of going, got it. So, and I didn't become a teacher, but I was effectively being a sort of a semi-high school teacher for a year. And I loved that experience. And it was, and I've kind of tried to do bits and pieces of that as I go forward. I had no advice on that one. I didn't know anyone who'd had a gap year, to be honest. No one in my world had ever gone and done that. But I'd read about it somewhere, and I thought that would be good, and it was a fantastic experience. I absolutely loved it. So then I went off to university and did engineering, and all of my peers from university went and worked in London, the box at the top, and they got jobs as lawyers and accountants and investment bankers. Some of them still are. And because everyone was doing that, I, with no coaching and no mentoring, decided, well, I'm not going to do that. I'm going to do something different. So I went and worked in the North Sea on an oil rig for a year. And it was a completely mad adventure and not one I'd want to do for the rest of my life, but it was a fantastic year there. And then I went and worked in Syria, and that's my main memory of the town I lived in Syria, which was called Deir ez-Zor, on near the Iraqi border, was that there were watermelon mountains. In watermelon season, there would just, a truck would come up like this and just basically there'd be just watermelon everywhere. And I was working as a wireline engineer, so I'd go in and test new wells when they were drilled. And the experiences I got through that, so not only sort of living for a year in a little town in the Syrian desert, and loving that, the cultural experience and the challenging everything about what you're doing, and then another experience sitting on an oil rig in the North Sea, which is it's kind of mind-blowing. I remember at one point, one of my sisters lived in Kathmandu during that period, and I went to have a holiday with her, and I was within a period of 3 days, I was went from a hike in the Himalayas to landing on a chopper in a storm in the North Sea, and it was just so many different things that came from all of that, from the high tech to the poverty of Syria in some places, but the education and the happiness of parts of Syria as well were really interesting. So it challenged me in many different ways. But I only did that for a couple of years. And just going on a slightly side note, more connected with my current work, really. So the town of Deir ez-Zor ended up right in the middle of ISIS territory in kind of the civil war in Syria. And if you go and search for a picture of Deir ez-Zor these days, you'll see that. And that's kind of the main street. And I used to kind of walk down that street, and it's probably repaired a bit. This maybe a couple of years ago now. But that was a fantastic, beautiful little rural town with on the banks of the Euphrates, well educated, and the Syrian conflict created that. The interesting bit for me on that is that the Syrian conflict partly started with the drought through the noughties in Syria, which was partly caused by increasing climate change and the impact there. And there's some really interesting papers on that. So a lot of people left the rural areas, they went to the main towns, they were unemployed and poor, and that caused a lot of angst, not surprisingly, and led to basically trying to overthrow the government. And then that led to the civil war and to a whole lot of things around ISIS, and then to people getting on boats to Greece and walking to Germany. So there's a link to climate change on the little town I lived in Syria. So slightly off topic, but it's for me it's a very powerful photo I use. So I did 2 years on the oil rigs, and then I went back and did another year at university in Dublin. That involved coming back to a student life after working was on oil rigs particularly, was very good, and suddenly became very easy. And then I had a choice at the end of that year. My choice was to go and lecture at Bulawayo Polytechnic in Zimbabwe, or go to London and get the Northern Line, which, if any of you have been to London, is very small and crowded and sweaty and horrible to work every day. So I chose the Northern Line. Again, didn't have any coaching and mentoring. For many, many years, I failed to get coaching and mentoring. I just sort of made decisions, and I actually regret that. I think I would have gone on a very different, I'm very happy with my career path, but I would have made some very different decisions if I'd stretched my thinking a little bit from beyond what I knew. So in London, I designed buildings. That's I spent a lot of time on that building in the middle at the bottom. The one on the right is Somerset House, and I spent a lot of time designing and building a museum that's in the bottom of that. But it was a really fun time, and it was in London and for a few years. Then I moved to Australia, and there's a critical point actually before I get to this slide and talk about this slide. So I arrived in Australia, and I went and I was a fairly frustrated engineer. I enjoyed building the first building, or the first floor of the first building, but it got boring if I started doing it again and again and again. So I was a frustrated engineer, and I arrived in Sydney, and I went and got a whole lot of psychometric testing done, and I paid some recruitment person to ask me difficult questions. And I'd never done anything like that before. And you've probably all done it, because psychometric testing happens all over the place now, but it didn't I'd never come across it. And I had this wonderful chat with a woman, and I've lost her contact details because I want to thank her for changing the way I went. She told me I needed to go and network. I needed to go and build my contacts and meet lots and lots of people and talk to lots of people and get advice. So go and get some mentoring, but also build a network. And I finished that day telling her that I wanted to be an environmental entrepreneur. And this was in the late 90s. I'd never heard of those two words put together. I didn't know what the hell it meant, but I kind of thought that's what I want to be, and she sort of helped me get to that point. So that advice on, kind of testing my assumptions, testing my thinking, testing my plan of, what I thought was a sensible path, was critical. And I had no idea what an environmental entrepreneur was or how I'd get there. But that thought never went away. Without that intervention, I think I wouldn't have ended up what I'm doing now. So what I started doing was at the top left, I designed another building, worked as a structural engineer, and it was a very nice building, and it was a very boring process to design it for me. I also was offered a job to run the National Precast Concrete Association, which is not something you may have come across. And at the same time offered a job with Origin Energy to become a project manager to build pipelines. And I chose project manager, bigger company, because I don't know, it was getting less technical and more, kind of more a little bit broader than just technical. And for me, I liked the technical stuff. I enjoyed the technical stuff, but I wanted something that took me a little bit broader in my thinking, and that was useful. After a couple of years of running building pipelines and running the gas network, I then kind of moved into corporate development. And I found these slides the other day. I haven't seen these slides for about 15 years, and it was quite funny to find them. It's all very old, so not confidential, but maybe don't screenshot it and send it to Origin. So I came up with all sorts of, how does Origin change its world? I was kind of asked to really push the boundaries, change how Origin would work. What should they do? Should they set up Origin Water? We did actually manage to set up a joint venture running a water company. Should we set up Origin China? And I was volunteering to go and set up the China office in 2003, or biofuels, or a sustainable investment fund. So I looked at all sorts of really interesting things. And none of them, well, almost none of them were taken up. And I was getting very frustrated. I ended up effectively self-destructing a corporate career, which in hindsight was brilliant, maybe not so good at the time. At the end of my time at Origin, there was another really critical point of mentoring and coaching. So we had a management development program. We did a whole lot of psychometric testing, same thing. And then I had a whole lot of one-on-one sessions with effectively a counselor, career counselor, and really tested, why was I getting angry? Why was I behaving that way? What was my frustration, and what did I really want to do? And that was a really powerful experience for me, and again changed my way of thinking and allowed me to break the cycle of thinking that I was in, and that was critical for what for where I went next. So again, this is probably off the record, but we're between friends. So I did find a 14 years ago, APA to buy Origin's network assets. So my last job at Origin was to do that deal. So I was managing the sale process. Halfway through, I was doing my MBA at the time, and I read a chapter on management buyouts, and actually put a bid in to buy it in the middle of the process, which failed dismally. But it was a hell of a goal. My mentoring previously, a few months earlier, had said I needed to go for big, hairy, audacious goals, and that would satisfy me. So I thought that was quite a good, big, hairy, audacious goal. and went for that. I then left Origin and thought I had a job at a company called Best and Pacific. 2 weeks after I left Origin, they were sued and I didn't have a job, which was a bit distressing. But then I went and set up my own company. Setting up your own company, people say, "Oh, that must have been, tell me about that. Would you do it? Would you do it again? Should I do it?" My advice to other people is, I would never advise you to set up your own company, and I would always do it again. And through that process where I met sort of Kadem and others, for 10 years, I did all sorts of things with networks and China and competitions and all sorts of things. And I had, my approval process was, yeah, sure. And off I went. I didn't get a great deal of mentoring through that process. I had a massive network, knew everybody, didn't get a great deal of mentoring. And I think this could have been more if I had. I also managed to write a book and went to COP 2021 in Paris and launched the book there. It was the whole experience of running my own business it was hard, it was exciting, it made me globally connected. But there was also the frustration that I wasn't able to really do a lot of work with big companies. I was just a boutique. So I came into Deloitte a couple of years ago, and we've been building up decarbonisation solutions. We've kind of created this in Australia. We're rolling it out globally. I'm working with some of the biggest companies in the world doing really cool things. And there's a whole lot of luck in that. The luck of landing in a big company and being and having the opportunities that I've managed to get. Last year we set up the Climate Leaders Coalition with a whole lot of CEOs. We're just about to launch a global version of that. But I think one of the key things is also recognizing luck. So people say the harder you work, the more luck you have. I disagree. The harder you work, the more likely you are to recognize luck when it walks past. Because you've thought about all the different ways things can happen. So what I've learned, what I'm kind of, having been around a while, I'm far better at playing the long game and trying to think about, okay, what do I really want to achieve with this? I happen to be in a big company with a great brand and access to every boardroom in the world if I need it. So how do I really sort of start driving impact? So that's my story, and I'll wrap up in a moment, but there was a couple of things I just wanted to, what are my lessons along the way, and where does mentoring and coaching come into that? So know yourself, and you may have done this in some of the other sessions, but it's really, really important to know yourself and know your weaknesses, and kind of how you behave and where, what's good and what's bad. And that there's a piece on that which is blocking out some of it, but there's kind of different characteristics. I'm entirely very strongly a pioneer, so creative person, and a driver, so somebody gets stuff done. The guardian is a detail person. I'm not. That is not my preferred way of working. But I need people around me really badly who can do that, because that's quite important. And the green one there is actually sort of an integrator. So being a people person, and I've got a bit of that. But knowing what you are likely to do and how people see you, and how I really annoy some people because I'm impatient and exacting, and so what are the characteristics that annoy other people, and then and then how do you interact with people? So how do I interact with a guardian? And there's lots of guardians. Engineers and accountants are all guardians almost. And so if you communicate in the wrong way, you will fail for them. They will not hear what you're saying. And that was my lesson of Origin Energy, was that they were all guardians, and I was communicating in a way that they just could not hear what I was saying. And if people don't agree with you or don't support you, then there's a number of reasons why. Maybe you're wrong. Happens quite often. Maybe you're talking at the wrong level. Maybe you haven't really understood their needs and worries and what they are worried about, and their emotional place. or you haven't spoken in a way that they can hear. And I think that's a really important thing to think through. And from a climate change point of view, in my mind, it's all about psychology and communications, and an understanding that all decisions are emotional. And I'm going to happy to talk a bit more about that in the questions. Understanding why do people resist change? If you haven't, it's a very dull book, this book by Thomas Kuhn, but as a theory, it's a really powerful theory about how change happens and how paradigms shift. Find your passion and go with that, but get your mentor or coach to tell you what your passion is. So environmental entrepreneurs, 10 years after someone had made me say the word, I published a paper on it. And then that's kind of what I am, an environmental entrepreneur. Be a stubborn optimist. There is no point not being a stubborn optimist, and don't waste your energy. Get shit done. Dream big, and no regrets. This is a wonderful book if you ever want to have a reason for why you should always go with what you want to do. This is a story of a nurse who interviewed dying patients for 15 years about what was their biggest regret, and it's a great sobering read and makes you not make any of those, hopefully. That's it. I've run a little over time. Apologies, Kadem, but happy to take a couple of questions if there's time.
No worries. Thank you very much, John, for sharing your life experiences and your points about mentorship experience and the recommendations at the end. Given the time, maybe we have time for one question. Anyone?
I have a question.
Justin.
Oh.
Yeah.
No, we got two. I think someone else jumped in as well.
We got two. Okay, so let's try and make it two questions.
Okay, two quick questions.
Yeah.
You mentioned the psychometric testing a couple of times, John. Just interested to know whether you found that useful kind of in and of itself, or was it more the sort of, the coaching discussions that triggered afterwards?
The psychometric testing, did you say? So
yeah, that's right. Yeah, I think you mentioned that a couple of times.
Yeah, I mean, you need both. I think on their own, it's helpful, but you need someone to then challenge you, particularly I think where my time at Origin, where I ended up being quite frustrated, but everyone was finding me quite frustrating, and I never realized that. Everyone else is an idiot. Clearly I'm right and everyone else is wrong. But it's just to be challenged on that. You can read it and go, yeah, that's kind of how I am. But it doesn't help you really sort of understand how other people see you or how you behave. So I do think the combination is the most powerful.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Cool. And then Nick.
Yeah, just a quick one. I was just curious to know which test this is, because there are so many out there, and I was just
I'll dig out the name of it. It's called business chemistry, but I'll put a link in the chat in a few minutes. So
yeah, thank you.
Cool.
It's a good one. I've done quite a few. So.
Thank you very much, John, again. And given time, we'll switch directly to Mika.